Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to the last lecture in this section of the course. So this is the S3 IAM and CloudFront summary. We will touch upon S3 IAM and CloudFront in more sort of peripheral areas throughout the rest of the course, but we did need a section just dedicated to it. This section pretty much is one of the most important sections going into the exam. So what did we learn? Well, we learned about the basics of IAM. We then went on to resetting root users. We learned that we should create a new root user password and basically have a strong password policy. We should delete the previous two-factor authentication and then recreate it. We should check if the root user has an access key ID and secret access key, and if so, we should delete these immediately. And we should just check the other user accounts and verify that they are legitimate. And if not, we should delete these. Then went on to IAM policies. We learned that IAM is global, so it applies to all areas of AWS, not just S3. So obviously you create IAM policies for EC2, for Lambda, for DynamoDB, for anything, recognition, etc., etc. There are three different types of IAM policies. We have our AWS managed policies, which have the cool little AWS icon, which means that AWS manage them for us, and they can be applied across multiple AWS accounts, literally hundreds of thousands to millions. We then have our own customer managed policies. These are on a per account basis, but they can be applied across multiple different services. And then we have inline policies, which are a one-to-one relationship. So we can have a specific IAM policy for a specific user, group, or role. S3 policies, we learned that S3 bucket policies are attached only to S3 buckets. S3 bucket policies specify what actions are allowed or denied on the bucket, and they can be broken down to a user level. So Alice can do a put but not a delete, and John could do a read but not a put, etc. Remember that they are bucket level only and they are S3 only. We also learnt that an explicit deny inside our S3 bucket policies always overrides an allow. So if we have an allow in IAM, for example, well, let's just talk about S3. I mean, if we deny everyone access to read, but then we have a specific allow for John, John's still not going to be able to read that because the deny will override the allow. Let's move on to S3 ACLs. They're pretty legacy. AWS don't recommend that you use them unless you are doing, you need to apply specific policies on objects themselves. Then you should use S3 ACLs. Bucket policies can only be applied at the bucket level, whereas an S3 ACL can be applied to the individual file level. We then looked at S3 policy conflicts, and these are fundamentally important to understand in the exam. So what happens if your IAM policy basically conflicts with your S3 bucket policy, which conflicts with an object ACL? How do you go through and sort them? So remember that there's always least privilege, and the decision always defaults to a deny. Also remember that an explicit deny always trumps an allow. If no method specifies an allow, then the request is going to be denied by default. That's because we have at least privilege, so decisions always default to a deny. And then of course, only if no methods specify a deny and one or more methods specify an allow will the request be allowed. Basically, learn this diagram going into the exam, or learn this decision flow going into the exam. It's going to pick you up between 5 to 10 marks. So decision always starts at a deny. You evaluate all your policies. Is there an explicit deny? Yes, well, that's it. It's denied. If there's no explicit deny, is there an allow? Can you see an explicit allow in any of the policies? If so, then yes, it's going to be allowed. If there's not an explicit deny and there's not an explicit allow, then it's going to be a deny because of least privilege. So if you remember this going into the exam, you are going to pick up at least 5 to 10 marks. Moving on to AWS Secure Transport. So you can basically put in a condition, a Boolean condition. So you can say if true, then do this. If false, then do this. So you would basically restrict S3 bucket access to only use HTTPS using the following conditions. So you'd say the condition is if the secure transport in this case is false. So if you're not using secure transport, then deny. or you could just say if you are using secure transport, then allow. So if secure transport equals true, then allow. Of course, you always want to pretty much have an explicit deny, because that will always deny it. So I'd use this and then do an allow on top, where it is saying AWS secure transport is true. And then that way, basically the only way you can access that bucket or objects within that bucket is using HTTPS. Do not confuse this with cross-region replication, however. You do not need to use a bucket policy with secure transport to replicate objects using SSL. It's always going to be done by default. Also remember with cross-region replication that delete markers are replicated, however, deleted version of the files are not. That is a built-in security mechanism. Remember that versioning must be enabled on both buckets, and remember that it's possible to use cross-region replication from one AWS account to another. The IAM role must have permissions to replicate objects in the destination bucket, and it's often a security best practice to have a separate AWS account with an S3 bucket, and essentially what you do is you take all your CloudTrail logs that are replicated to your production account, to your S3 bucket, turn on cross-region replication, replicate those CloudTrail logs off to this separate AWS account with a separate S3 bucket, and literally that's the only permissions allowed. You're allowed to send data there. You can't go and read that data, and you can't go in and delete that data. It essentially becomes a black hole, and then the only people that are allowed to access that separate AWS account would be your auditors. That is AWS best practice, so do bear that architecture in mind when going into the exam. And then finally, we moved on to pre-signed URLs. So we learned that we can access objects using pre-signed URLs. Typically, these are done via the SDK, but in our example, we did it via the CLI. So we did it using the CLI. I think I still have to go in and delete that EC2 instance, actually. Thank you for reminding me. And they exist for a certain length of time in seconds. The default is 1 hour, so 3,600 seconds. But of course, you can change this using the expires in the CLI, followed by the number of seconds. You can also change it using the API. So you can change the default, almost time to live for the pre-signed URL. So do bear that in mind. And then finally, just remember how STS integrates with Active Directory or with any kind of other identity provider. So typically you would have your users, they're here, they're trying to log into, let's say it's an enterprise reporting application, it could be anything, it could be your intranet, whatever. So they're logging in and they're going via an identity broker. This is something that either is off-the-shelf software or something that you've designed yourself. And the identity broker is literally just taking their usernames and passwords. It's then sending this to LDAP and it's comparing against Active Directory. It could also be comparing this against Facebook. It could be comparing this against Amazon or LinkedIn or Google or whatever, any OAuth provider. But in this example, it's Active Directory. And once it matches that username and password back, you're going to get a little token from Active Directory or from your identity provider. You're then going to go over to the security token service. It's going to then issue you with also an STS token. And then the users will then attempt to access something in, say, S3. And then what S3 will do is it will take the STS token that they've got, and it will pass that on to IAM, and IAM will just see whether or not the STS token is valid and that it's within its time to live. And if it is, it will then grant access to S3. So you don't actually need to memorize all the steps. The important thing to understand is authentication goes against Active Directory first, then we go to Security Token Services, and then once Security Token Services has given us our token, when we try and access any kind of AWS resource using our application, that's going to go to Identity Access Management and pass this STS token back to IAM. IAM is going to validate that, and if it works, then it will give you access to S3. So that is it for this lecture, guys. Definitely, seriously, before you go into the exam, like one of the last things you do, watch this summary lecture one more time because this will pick you up a huge number of marks in the exam. Hopefully, you've learnt an awful lot about IAM, S3, and CloudFront. And let's move on to the next section. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next section. Thank you.